question before the House today, it's not a motion, it's a question, is democracy a series of conflicts? And we start off with the first speaker, Mr. Proshenjit Basu. Gives me great pleasure to invite you, sir, up to the podium to give your opinion on is democracy a series of conflicts?
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. My answer is no. Human life itself involves a series of conflicts. Autocracy and democracy are two approaches to dealing with the conflicts that societies inevitably face. Autocracy entails crushing particular forms and sources of conflict, usually oppressing some classes or ethnicities in order to create a veneer of orderliness and harmony. But autocrats like Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Churchill, and Pol Pot caused all the atrocities of the 20th century. Many politicians in democracies, of course, do thrive on conflict. But democracy goes far beyond conflict. The truly successful democrat is one who reconciles conflict and thus brings a lasting harmony to society. So I will cite the US, UK, Japan, and India to argue that democracy is not merely a series of conflicts. Conflicts are inevitable in society, but a successful democracy reconciles conflicts to create greater and more lasting harmony than other forms of governance can. If you think of the great American presidents, the names that come immediately to mind are Lincoln, Washington, and FDR. All war presidents, defined almost completely by the wars they fought and won. But war marks the utter breakdown of democracy. The truly consequential American presidents of the 20th century were Reagan and Clinton, who presided over peace and prosperity, and George H.W. Bush, who ended the Cold War. Although differing in their ideologies, Reagan, Bush Sr., and Clinton provided a trifecta of social changes that restored dynamism to the American economy, its strategic primacy in the world, and a structural reduction in public debt that fundamentally reduced the degree of domestic conflict. That Bush Jr. had to run as a compassionate conservative in the 2000 election was the surest sign of Clinton's success in reducing conflict. Just as Clinton became a fiscal conservative because Reagan had changed the conversation. Turning now to Britain, the true heroes of British democracy are not the failed proto-autocrat and imperialist Winston Churchill, but the genuinely democratizing Tory visionaries Benjamin Disraeli and Margaret Thatcher. Disraeli embraced social harmony by extending the franchise to almost all men, surprising the Liberals with an act of magnanimity that secured for the Tories decades of gratitude from a vastly widened electorate. Maggie Thatcher's genius was to make the working class owners of homes too. They thus focused not just on wages, but became more interested in interest rates. Thatcher weakened unions, not by using batons, but by using economics. And the consequence was a remaking of politics that forced the opposition Labour Party to embrace the market and become more centrist. The result was greater prosperity for Britain during the long Thatcher major era of peace and prosperity, and hence reduced conflict. Mark one more success for democracy. Contrast Thatcher with the failures of the autocratic Churchill. He created Iraq in 1920 by riding roughshod over democracy there as colonial secretary. When the Shias of Basra and Karbala rose in revolt at his perfidy, he bombed them with the Royal Indian Air Force planes. And in the Second World War, his empire east of India fell quickly to Japan. Churchill retaliated by perpetrating the Great Bengal Famine of 1943-44. In the end, even his electorate didn't support more war, preferring the peaceable intentions of Attlee as the better path to democratic harmony. Churchill was an autocrat, not a democrat. Modern Japan is the epitome of democratic success. A society that is prosperous and egalitarian, where the air is pristine, the ground spotless and peaceful, and where society is fortified by moral values that are implicitly accepted by the majority. Between 1950 and 1990, Japan's per capita income increased tenfold, and yet income equality is greater there than anywhere else in Asia, and almost among the best in the world. Japan, since 1950, has decisively refuted the idea that democracy is a series of conflicts. Which brings me to India. Indira Gandhi routinely finishes atop India Today's periodic polls on who India's best prime minister was. I find this utterly bizarre. Indira had the worst economic record of all our prime ministers, other than Charan Singh, during her first 11 years in office. She then bequeathed us the Khalistan, Assam separatist, and Tamil Eelam crises in her final 5-year term in office. In the Congress Eye, or Indira, she created the greatest public relations machine in Indian political history. That machine makes us forget that after 9 years of failure as prime minister, Indira suspended democracy and ruled as an autocrat for 18 dark months. When she came back to power in 1980, she created Bhindranwale to checkmate the Akalis in Punjab, and in Assam and Sri Lanka, she played with fire too. In the end, the autocrat was consumed by the conflicts she had created, as indeed was her son. It was left to the democratic sagacity of P.V. Narasimha Rao to re-establish harmony after Indira's autocratic depredations. Narasimha Rao not only transformed the economy by overhauling the labyrinthine system of controls and protections, but he also solved the Punjab and Assam problems. Rao represented the epitome of democracy, reconciling conflicts to create more harmony. Which brings me finally to Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Not only has he made India the fastest growing large economy in the world, he has done so while cleaning our cities, villages, and rivers. What Rao started, Modi has completed. The transformation of all of society and its preparation for full participation in modernity. Disgracefully, in 2014, less than half of India's households had access to a toilet, a bank account, or a cooking gas connection. Almost all households have them now. Muslims as well as Hindus, Dalits as well as Brahmins are included in the 98 to 100% Indians being accorded the basics of a civilized existence that more than half of them had been denied until 2014.
We have to wrap up now, Professor Basu.
Modi has thus reconciled the 67-year conflict between haves and have-nots, thus vastly enhancing social harmony. It is the warmongers and autocrats like Churchill and Indira who foster conflict. Democrats don't allow a series of conflicts. They reduce and reconcile them. Thank you, and Jai Hind.
Thank you, Professor Basu. You know, somehow when anybody speaks about somebody who's most anti-democratic in the world, almost ever, you always find a reference to Adolf Hitler. The irony is that Adolf Hitler was elected in a completely fair democratic election to power, which is itself the paradox or the conflict of democracy. Pradeep?
Thank you, Shandip. To present a viewpoint that may agree with Mr. Basu or perhaps differ completely, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend Ashutosh. Yes, you come on second, Ashutosh, to speak on whether he sees democracy as a series of conflicts or if he thinks democracy is the best way to attain peace.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not a natural speaker in the language, English language, so please bear with me. I know why this subject has been chosen. Is democracy a series of conflicts? Because today when we are living in, we know that the democracy is in danger. There are serious conflicts in Indian society. I will not say that it started with 2014. Probably it started much earlier. But today the reflection is so grave and so stark that we are all thinking that whether democracy is really a kind of governance India deserves, or we as a society do not deserve democracy as a concept. Sometimes we do forget that it's easy to talk about Western democracies. It's easy to talk about America, England. It's easy to talk about Europe and other countries. But if democracy has succeeded in establishing itself as a concept, if it has really proved that there is a one form of governance which can be called the best form of governance, it's democracy, because democracy has succeeded in a country like India. India is not a country, it's a civilization which is so full of contradictions. Americans cannot even think about it. The Britishers cannot even think about it. It's not only the contradiction of religion, culture, region, everything. You come to Calcutta, you find a different city. You go to Bombay, it's altogether different world. You go to Guwahati, you'll find difficult. You go to Chennai and suddenly you say, I can't even understand a word. You will be more comfortable in London, you will be more comfortable in Washington than in Chennai because the language is so strange. And then we sometimes forget that what is Hinduism? Do we really understand Hinduism per se? It is a coalition of, so Indian civilization is a coalition of so many things. It's a coalition of regions. It's a coalition of castes. It's a coalition of subcastes. It's a coalition of multiple identities. It's a coalition of language. You just keep talking about it and realize. Even in UP, I belong to UP, I come from a city called Lucknow. There are several places in Lucknow you will find it difficult to understand. There's so much linguistic diversity. And if, as a society, we survived for the last 70 years, and we successfully implemented democracy, and still we dare call it that it's a series of conflict, I can only laugh at it. I have no other way to talk about it. You know, we have forgotten that with one stroke of constitution, the thousands of years of diversity, the caste structure, we suddenly realize everybody is equal in this country. The Shudras, which are never allowed to stand before the Brahmins and the upper caste, suddenly the constitution has done such revolution that probably we upper caste people, we do not realize what kind of revolution has been unleashed by the constitution. So how it is possible? It is possible because democracy has successfully, it's not the series of conflicts, it's a series of consensus. It's a series of conflict-making mechanism. And if one person who can be the best exponent of that, if I could call, is Mr. Mahatma Gandhi. When Mr. Gandhi, when he came to India, it was not a mass movement. The biggest challenge was that such a divided society can be converted into one society which could fight against the Britishers and successfully achieve freedom. He did it. Probably Westerners will not find it difficult. Probably the Westerners should come to India and do a research that how India with such diversities, with so many contradictions and conflicts, has resolved it. How the Indian system is so resilient that it absorbs the terrorism in Punjab. It is trying to fight the terrorism in Kashmir. It has successfully fought terrorism in Northeast. It has successfully fought the demand for creation of Dravidistan in South India. Now you go to South India, you will not see those kind of things. There are Maoists. There are Kashmir insurgents. There are also right-wingers which want to turn everything which is right with this country and with this civilization. There is a project which is running in this country who want to turn the thousands years of Hinduism into some kind of a cult. But democracy allows it. I agree. The Adolf Hitlers are product of democracy. I will not say there are other people also a product of this democracy. It's a serious test for Indian democracy, and I'm 100% confident that India will survive not as a society, not as a democracy, but as a civilization. Because if economic growth is a parameter, then I can only say that probably people have very little understanding of India as a civilization, as a resilient society, and as something which has successfully fought different civilizations and successfully survived and is still flourishing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashutosh, who clearly felt that we have in India not a conflict as far as democracy is concerned, but a coalition. And if we didn't have it, we are heading towards one anyway, I think, very soon. You know, I was driving to the Calcutta Club this evening, and I was thinking, what is the relationship between a conflict and democracy? Here we are, wonderful democracy. We can all go and cast our votes. We have these beautiful electronic voting machines, and we can look at the name and the color and press with our right index finger, then come away with a finger stained with a little bit of ink to show us how greatly we have participated in those that will lead our nation into the next century and beyond. And then I thought, hang on a second. The biggest conflict is, I don't want to vote for A. Good God, he's not fit to be a leader. And then I think, oh my God, I don't want to vote for B either. Why the hell should I want to vote for C? And then I end up with that right. To exhibit my democratic right, I have to go and vote for that creature called Nota. And then I think, is it worth traveling so far to cast my vote for an inanimate object? And then I ask myself, should I go to vote at all? So many conflicts, thinking just about the fact that I'm going to go and vote in an election. But so far, neither of our panelists have felt there is any conflict in democracy at all. And we wait to see what our third panelist is going to say, as I have great pleasure in inviting Geoffrey Byrne of the BBC to the dais. The Irish have never seen conflicts, so Jeff Burns is rightly suited to talk about democracy and conflicts.
The Irish have never seen conflicts. Hello. Hey, thank you for inviting me. I'm honoured to be in such illustrious company. Now, a lover of Indian democracy and a lover of Indian railways, Mark Tully, formerly BBC correspondent here, told a story once about the Chhattisgarh Express and how the newly appointed railway minister needed to make it more efficient, so closed down a few of the little stations along the way. When he came back from his 2 weeks holiday, he found they'd been reopened. The people had spoken. They needed them. They got a hold of their MPs and said, we must have these stations open. It's for our livelihood. They were reopened and they stayed open. And Mark Tully told us that was a symbol of Indian democracy and a conflict solved. Where I work at the BBC in London, we have a statue just been put up of George Orwell, the author of 1984. And there's a little inscription next to the statue. And it's from Orwell, and it reads, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. And I agree. Argument, conflict, democracy, liberty, they all go together. Is democracy a series of conflicts? Yes, of course it is. And that's a good thing. It's inevitable. And conflicts which can be resolved. Otherwise, there's no movement. There's no progress. Look at the country I live in and work in, the United Kingdom. Politicians have all this week been leaving the major parties and forming their own groups. It's largely down to Brexit, the dissatisfaction with Brexit. 2 years ago, there was a referendum. Should the people of the United Kingdom leave the European Union? Well, they voted, and they voted 52% to 48% to leave. And according to the Prime Minister, Theresa May, that's the will of the people. Well, her opponent said, that's actually the will of half the people. What about the large minority that didn't want to leave? What about the Remainers? But she was adamant. The United Kingdom will leave the European Union on March 29th, which is only a few weeks away. Well, the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, wasn't too impressed. He said there's a special place in hell for those people who advocated Brexit with no real plan of how to carry it out safely. That's a conflict which is yet to be resolved. Are things any better in America? Well, a lot of US commentators were apprehensive when Trump went to the White House. He had no experience whatsoever of public office. He insults his political opponents, and he calls the free press the enemies of democracy. Just last week, my colleague, the BBC cameraman Ron Skeens, was attacked by a drunken Trump supporter at a rally in El Paso, Texas. The cameraman was kicked, his camera was kicked, and the drunken attacker had a baseball cap on with the words, "Make America Great Again" across it. Are things any better in Russia? Well, recently I helped to judge the Young Journalist of the Year competition at the Foreign Press Association in London. And the winner is a young Russian journalist, and she's brilliant at uncovering electoral fraud in St. Petersburg. What she's done is not only superb journalism, it's also very brave, because 6 journalists from her newspaper, Novaya Gazeta, have been killed since the turn of the century for doing their jobs. In fact, throughout the world last year, 94 journalists were killed while doing their job. I think a free press is essential to any democracy worthy of the name. Well, what did Socrates make of it all? You know, he didn't approve of universal suffrage. He didn't believe everybody should have a vote. He thought you should only be able to vote if you studied politics carefully, the morals of politics, the philosophy of politics. And that's led to his followers today saying we shouldn't be allowed to vote unless we pass a certain test. Just like if you want to drive a car, you have to pass a driving test. Although looking around this city today, I'm not sure if that's true here. But yeah, Socrates was eventually accused of corrupting the youth, and a jury of 500 people voted him guilty by 52% to 48%. There's that figure again. And he was executed. But from ancient Greece bang up to the present day, and this week a parliamentary inquiry in the UK branded Facebook a digital gangster, destroying democracy. Why? Because they're actively disseminating fake news, they're revealing private details of the users, and they're being slow to remove illegal posts. The era of self-regulation, Facebook was told, is over. There's another conflict. Can that one be resolved? I think so. I'm optimistic. I think conflict's inevitable. I think if you address these problems, they can be resolved. Who would have thought in 1989 the Berlin Wall would come down as people left oppression and yearned for a place in a democratic society? Who would have thought 5 years later Nelson Mandela would have been elected president of South Africa, where he'd been locked up on Robben Island for years? In his acceptance speech for the presidency, he showed no bitterness. He said, let's work together with the white minority. We can work together for the country that we all want, with better schools, better hospitals, clean water, electricity, paved roads. But we have to work together. That's a good motto, and I'm hopeful. I think the nicest definition of democracy I ever heard was from the writer E.B. White in America. He said, you know, it's the feeling of privacy in the voting booth. It's a feeling of communion in the libraries. It's a feeling of vitality everywhere. It's the mustard on your hot dog, and it's the cream in your coffee. Let's cherish democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. I loved your comment about George Orwell, or your reference to him. And I just can't help remembering another quotation of George Orwell about democracy, when he writes, all men are equal, but some men are more equal than others. On that note, Pradeep, would you like to introduce the next speaker?
Thank you, Shandip. My favorite line from George Orwell, unfortunately something else, it says, they look from man to beast and from beast to man, and already it was difficult to make out who was who. Well, that's, if you remember, is the last line in 1984. It gives us great pleasure to request Mr. Deshratan Nigam, spokesman for the RSS, to put forward his view on whether democracy is a series of conflicts or it's a process, the best available process for reconciliation.
It's my pleasure to be
there in Kolkata, a city of knowledge. From my childhood, I always considered this place as a city of knowledge. And Mr. Rao initially said that he's very confused with the topic. If he hears about my confusion, I think he will run away. Well, when Adam was there, he had absolute freedom. But then the nature did not like Adam's nature and gave him a companion. Since then, we have populated this planet, and therefore there was a need to organize the freedom. And hence we have a representative democracy today, which you call as a republic. So from there, I take it forward. But then Mahagathbandhan takes place in, not exactly, but the meeting takes place in Kolkata. The cases against Mamata Banerjee are instituted at the instance of a Congress. The cases against Robert Vadra are instituted at the instance of Kejriwal. The cases against Mayawati are instituted at the instance of Akhilesh Yadav, and against Akhilesh Yadav at the instance of Mayawati. This is democracy and conflict at its best. And this is where lies the beauty. And this is where actually the mandate is defeated at the end of the day. When you see post-poll alliances, the conflicting parties become partners in bed. That is where the entire process is defeated. If you look at the entire history of democracy, we go back to the Rig Veda. You have sabhas and samitis there, numerous mention of sabhas, which are a larger body, and samiti is a smaller body. Therefore, you see the roots there, and the conflicts are also there. Look at the 16 Janpads which are there. 2 of them were republic, and they had a very high status, Wajis and Mallas and Asakas. Therefore, this, I take it as a dynamic process, an evolutionary process. Democracies give rise to conflict, and conflict give rise to democracies. It's evolutionary and dynamic both. And therefore, it's not a flaw, but an asset. However, please remember, it has to be within manageable limits. If the conflict is not managed through conflict resolution mechanism, which we have in India, a parliament is a form of conflict resolution. You have various other systems coming up, like Lokpal and Lokayukt, trying to resolve the conflicts. If it is within the zone of tolerance, it is good for democracy. Beyond that, it is havoc. Please remember that. Bangladesh was created out of conflict. Conflict within a religious community in Bangladesh, based on racial superiority, and with the help of India, Bangladesh was created. Pakistan is an example where conflict created a democracy called Pakistan, but then what happened? It's in a perpetual state of conflict and democracy, rather a small sprinkling of democracy, more like a dictatorship controlled by army. Conflicts have destroyed democracy. Look at West Asia, what happened. But it has created democracy like Cambodia. So it's a two-way process. It creates and destroys. It has to be managed well within its limits or boundaries. If you do not put in place conflict resolution mechanisms, it goes out of hand. And please look at our own internal system that we have. Tamil struggle that has taken place, it got finally resolved, but through a bloody means. So sometimes state and countries resort to violence to preserve democracy. That is what has also happened in the past. And look at, sometimes, look at the Khalistani movement. It was a manufactured, Bhindranwala was created. And then we had to pay a huge price. The mishandling of Kashmir, which has taken place, the conflict of Kashmir, where you see alienation on the ground. Therefore, conflicts have to be managed, and conflict resolution mechanisms have to be put in place. That is where I think the need arises to be very, very careful in choosing such kind of a topic where taking extreme positions may be very difficult. Being a dynamic and evolutionary process that this entire issue is India is still not a very mature democracy. Something happens in Pulwama, and we keep on debating. The nation is debating. Some say no, some say yes. There has to be a unified response for the world, so that an appropriate, measured response, whatever it may be, trust your government, trust your prime minister. You have elected them. Let them give a response which is befitting, which secures your own democracy. Then there is a role of religion that comes into play. Is religion greater than your nation? That debate is also going on within the country. That also gives rise to a huge amount of conflict. So therefore, it's a dynamic and evolutionary process with specific responses depending on space and time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Nigam. Thank you for an accurately timed speech. Well, we've had 4 speakers this evening, 2 speaking. The first 2 said that conflict was an integral part of democracy. I would venture to say that the 3rd and the 4th speaker took the opposite tack and went completely the other way. But it's time, I think, to have a little bit of fun. You remember those cards we spoke to you about? The red and the yellow cards? So let's see, a little down halfway in this debate, may I request you, how many of you think that democracy is a series of conflicts? You have to hold up the red to us. The red part, raise your red. If you think so, democracy is a series of conflicts, raise the reds.
Those of you that have voting
I don't
pads-
want to see the yellows now. I'll ask the yellows to come up later. All of you who think it is a series of conflicts, raise the red. Thank you. And how many of you think it's not conflict? How many of you think it's not a conflict? Well, at this stage, the reds have a lead, Shandip?
Yeah, let's check the electronic system.
Yes. Can
Those
we have
of you that have a voting pad,
How many of you have a voting pad? So if you say, if you think it is a series of conflicts, will you please press yes? We'll show you the score just now, live.
press A if you
Press
think
A.
yes.
If you think it is conflict, press A, please. Press A.
You have 10 seconds to press.
You can see the timer on top. It's coming down to 0. So please press A if you think it is a series of conflicts. Okay. Wow. And how many of you think the numbers are 14? And how many of you think it's not a series of conflict? Will you please press B if you think it's the other way around? Press B if you think it's not conflict. Wow. I think we have consensus in the House. Now, first an apology. The reason why we didn't give all of you a voting tab is because we couldn't source that many voting tabs. It was not our intention at any point of time to create 2 different levels of citizens and to precipitate a conflict. We want to be democratic 100%. Right, Shandip? Well, our next speaker, Shandip, will you do the honors?
One of the conflicts of democracy is that we're all equal in casting our votes. Some of us have to put on our glasses, find that piece of paper, not be colorblind, choose the right color, then raise it. The other raise their right hand, use a lot of muscle power of one whole upper limb to do so. The others in democracy can just use a little index finger, minimum force against a little circular black object on an electronic piece that they're holding in their hand. But we do not have any conflicts in our democracy. We still are all equal. That's what a lot of us still believe. Speaking next, Mr. Jerry Rao. And we all wait with bated breath whether Mr. Rao is at conflict with democracy or with conflict in democracy or sees democracy in conflicts.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to suggest that this whole proposition is a mischievous and silly one. It should have been worded completely differently if we were to have a more meaningful discussion about it. But since it's there, And since so many of my preceding speakers have nevertheless very intelligently and cleverly talked around it, I think that's the only way to deal with this proposition. Because democracy is not about conflicts, as so many of them have said. It's about resolution of conflicts. It's absence of democracy that creates conflicts. Democracy is about debate, about discussions, about endless committee meetings, about endlessly having arguments in the courthouse. It's a continuing conversation. Conflict happens only when the conversation breaks down. If you think about the examples when democracy broke down and conflicts happened, let's start with the English Civil War, when Charles I was not willing to have a dialogue with the elected parliament. You had a civil war. If you think of the American Civil War, when Lincoln was elected, Lincoln did not attack the South. It was the South that initiated the military hostilities. They could have easily come to Washington, D.C. as members of the elected Congress and continued the debate on slavery, extension of slavery, on whatever they wanted to. They chose not to. It is the absence of democracy that created a war in the United States, which the military casualties in the US Civil War exceeded the military casualties in World War I, World War II, Korean War, and Vietnam War put together on a much lower population base. So that's what happens when democracy breaks down. It's a horrifying nightmare. And nightmare happened just a few 100 kilometers from this city in 1971, when democracy broke down. After all, Mujib had won the election. Should he not have been called for taking power, for discussion, for debate, even if you don't like the man? That's neither here nor there. That's what democracy is about. When that doesn't happen, there is a breakdown. That is when conflict happens. So this proposition is really not there. Ashutosh mentioned something very interesting about how democracy in our country has actually been able to create a mosaic, a salad bowl, to continue to function. Let's take one issue, language. We in the South were extremely upset with Hindi for many years. Some compromise was evolved. Hindi was announced, but frankly, English continues, and all the courts of India still continue to use English. So, and over the years, Bollywood has made an impact in South India, so Hindi is less resented. So, the issue has been diffused. The same has happened with a lot of our problems in the Northeast. The issues have been diffused. There are now probably more young Northeasterners in Delhi and Calcutta and Bangalore and Pune than back in their home states, working very hard and very productively. So the issue, there's an interesting thing in Thatcher's book. Thatcher's your heroine, Mr. Basu. When Gorbachev went to see her, he said, I'm having a great deal of problems holding the Soviet Union together. And she said, that's because you don't have democratic impulses in your country. Why don't you go study India? They have far more diversity, they're far poorer, and many more difficulties. But somehow, not that there's zero violence. There is violence, there are riots, there are strikes, there are demonstrations, police firings. Just Telangana, which was created just 3-4 years ago. The movement went on for 50 years. For 50 years, there was debate, dialogue, discussion. And finally, a new state was created through a constitutional amendment by due process, correctly, peacefully, and we move on. Not everything is perfect. And I think that is the most important thing to remember. Democrats are inherently Burkean conservatives. We do not believe that the tragic nature of the human condition can be completely eliminated. That is what autocrats believe. That is what the utopians believe. According to Mr. Plato from Greece, if you appointed fellows who knew geometry and music as the guardians, then the state would be good. We reject that. We do not agree. We do not believe that a Pol Pot can create a utopia. But we can strive to continue to talk, to continue to have a dialogue. Because when democracy breaks down, you have horrifying consequences. Democracy is not perfect, and if that had been the proposition, I think we would have all agreed. Yes, even within democracy, take your own state. After 30, 40 years of those guys ruling, you did get rid of them. It happened in democracy. So democracy can sometimes have these constructive impulses. It may not still be as good as you want, or some of you want, but that's life. You never get the perfection. So here is not 3 cheers, but 2 cheers for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rao. I mean, that was an amazing range of events that you covered from Charles I. Of course, we started with Plato, and then Charles I, the English Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, the American Civil War, right down to Mujibur Rahman and the Telangana agitation. Well, to be fair, Mr. Rao, 62 years ago, the citizens of this country were landed with a unique problem. We became a democratic country. In the many, many thousand years of this civilization, democracy had never had any universal acceptance. There were a few pockets of democracy, but India was overwhelmingly, the land south of the Himalayas, was overwhelmingly non-democratic. So give us a few years to get our act together. It's a learning process, as you said. It's an act that we are still learning. Well, it gives me great pleasure to invite my friend and colleague, Kunal Sarkar, to speak on the motion. Kunal, you have 6 minutes, and then the interrogation round starts. But after these last 2 speakers, maybe we'll do a bit of voting again. Let's see.
Mr. Chairman, sir, I cannot but pretend to replace the original speaker, neither in form nor of spirit, but I'll make an attempt. It's almost propitious that Jerry referred to the American Civil War. How many days has it been when the Calcutta police locked horns with the CBI, almost eyeball to eyeball, fist to fist? And I think, had it gone on for another 12 hours or so, there might have been a union facing a confederacy in the soil of this nation. So we were not desperately far away from that phenomenon, Jerry. We live in an aura of entertainment. Go home, switch on television, Netflix, whatever. The serials come with a statutory warning, a smattering of sex, violence, scandal, all totally unquestioned and unaccounted. And that is the characteristic of a soap opera called democracy, which is being enacted worldwide. And there is more pretense to it than substance. And that is my contention at this point of time. And my answer to the question is a non-ambiguous yes. It has reduced itself to a series of conflicts. Why so? Battle of Gettysburg, 1863. When did Lincoln make the speech? When he viewed over the corpses of 25,000 dead bodies, and he promised equality, liberty, and all of you, and 350 years later, you land up with Donald Trump. So this is what the process gives you. You look at India. Now, memory serves me right. Who was the Democrat in India? Ashok, Vikramaditya, the Mughal empires, the Senas, the Palas. Who was the Democrat you remember in India? And we acquired 2 things almost simultaneously: the disease called malaria and the process called democracy, both of which Europe got 2 diseases almost simultaneously. One was democracy along with the post-Napoleonic phenomenon of sexually transmitted diseases. India was spared that epidemic. We got typhoid and malaria instead. So what do we see in front of us? We have created a non-accountable, a non-transparent phenomenon, which gives us a series of conflicts, which gives us a kind of drama, a soap opera, in which you and I, the citizen, will act as an arbitrator for 1 out of 1,825 days, and that is the day of the election. And for the rest of the 1,084 days, the voters will transform themselves into victims, whereby the political process will not be questioned. It will never be questioned that between the cow and the donkey, between the upper caste and the lower caste, between the beef and the mutton, between the non-vegetarian and the vegetarian, how come out of the 543 seats that will go for vote, do any of you have the slimmest of ideas that what has been the behavior of the Human Development Index of each of the 543 constituencies over the matter of last 3 years? You will know about the caste, you will know about the party swing, you know about where Rahul Gandhi smiled or not, you will know whether Modi's chest has expanded or contracted, you will not know the answer to the question why this country is stuck with 25% literacy over the last 20 years. You will not have a question that why universal health care has become mud wrestling in the political arena between the center and the state. You will not have an answer to the question that what is going to be that particular day when any form of uniform civil code is going to be enacted. So rather than that, what will you and I will be taken through? You and I will be taken through an unending serial of conflicts. The hero will succeed the heroine. Sometimes you will have both of them. And at the end of it all, the result will be naught. I'm tempted to refer to some of the gods of democracy we have created over the years. When Gandhi was presented perhaps only once in his life with a serious democratic conflict with a certain Mr. Bose who did not live very far away from here, his behavior was not entirely democratic. You have mentioned Churchill. I think Professor Basu referred to Churchill. No matter what you think of Churchill, he got 50,000 votes more than Isaac Newton, and the whole of Great Britain voted him the greatest living Briton ever. The one who wanted to castrate the miners of South Wales and has resulted as a population control mechanism for Bengal in the pre-independence era. So that is the face of democracy, and as a citizen of this country, we want to make democracy accountable for its outcome. A process without outcome is a facade, is it a charade? It has no bearing on the life of a man on the ground. Until such day, as a distraught, hapless citizen, I am obliged to conclude it has been a series of regrettable conflicts which has been far removed from the aspirations of the common citizen. Thank you.
Thank you, Kunal. I really loved his reference to how we have heroes and heroines in our democracy, almost like a Bollywood film. But in this democracy which is controlled by heroes and heroines, we are all playing parts of the extras. I don't know whether this was a reference to direct reference or indirect reference to center-state relationships in this state of ours. You know, sometimes I wonder, the government, as Kunal said, seems to be on the back foot one day in 5 years and on the front foot driving where they like for the rest of the period. And I just wonder, there seems to be so many good programs for the common man in our democracy to stop any conflicts of, at least economic conflicts amongst us. The only way you find out who the money is going to is when you hear another speech in Parliament. All we find out is where the money is coming from, depending on whether we have a picture of a hero or a heroine on the billboard that advertises that particular scheme. I often wonder, why should we have photographs of our hero politicians or our heroine politicians on the billboards advertising programs, say for the economically deprived? They should have our photographs. After all, it's our money that's being used. Neither of the heroes nor the heroines' personal funds are disbursed for that. Maybe that's one of the big conflicts of our democracy. But now, before we get our esteemed panel of interrogators to give their opinion, can we have another quick opinion poll? One of the conflicts of our democracy. Those of us at this stage think that they definitely think democracy is a series of conflicts, show us the red card facing forwards. Okay, the majority seems not to have changed their opinion. Now, you don't have to be as fixed as the foundation of the Calcutta Club. You can change your opinion. Okay, what about the electronically endowed? Those of you who think that democracy is a series of conflicts and think yes, press A. Those of you think it is not, press B for no. So we can vote A and B together. And for this fantastic democratic right of yours, you are bestowed all of 9 seconds. Here we are. We see a swing. Elections are coming. We always notice swings even if it's one. There's a swing in the air. There's a lot of humidity as well, and it's getting really hot in this discussion. And we're going to invite our first discussant, who's going to discuss on what Professor Prosenjit Basu has told us. The first discussant is Mayuri Mukherjee. Remember, Professor Basu was vehement in his observation that democracy has nothing to do with conflicts. Mayuri, you have 5 minutes. Because again, in keeping with the democratic principles, you're endowed 1 minute less than the panelists.
Good evening, everyone. Professor Basu, my first question to you. Why is it that you mentioned consequential leaders should only be assessed by their economic policies? I say this because every leader that you advocated for in your speech, you spoke only of policies that they tried to generate that they tried to put on the general public, but you did not talk about the impact it had on the mind of a voter. When demonetization was implemented, you spoke about the process, but you did not talk about whether the voter actually understood the process before he had to be forced into following it.
I didn't mention demonetization, but I didn't only talk about economics, of course. When I talked about Maggie Thatcher, it was largely economics. But when I spoke about Indira Gandhi, I spoke about the influence that she had on things like the Punjab problem, the Assam problem, the Tamil Eelam issue. Those were not economic issues. Those were socio-political issues that were bases on which she created conflict. And my contention, based on what we're talking about today, my contention is that she was not a democrat. She was an autocrat, and the conflicts she created were classic responses of an autocrat. Just as British colonial rule was based on divide and rule, so was Indira Gandhi's approach to governance based on divide and rule. When autocracy didn't work, then she tried to divide to rule. And of course, the consequences were quite awful. With regard to economics, I'm an economist, of course, and that's why I have a bias towards economic policy. But when you think about developed societies like the US and the UK, most of the conflicts, most of the issues of democracies are economic. Of course, there are many other aspects that they also deal with, and what Reagan and Clinton were dealing with were not just economic issues, but it was on economic issues that they had the biggest impact. And my point about Reagan is that he changed the conversation in the United States, just as Thatcher changed the conversation in the UK, and the succeeding opponents of Reagan and Thatcher had to acknowledge that they had transformed the conversation and they had to move away from the left to the center. And similarly, Clinton also had the same impact. He forced the conversation to move more to the center, and that was reflected in the fact that Bush Jr. ran as a compassionate conservative when he first ran for office. So, and the compassionate conservative isn't merely an economic idea. Compassionate conservative deals with social aspects as well. So I don't know
Mayuri, tell us what you think of the subject. Do you think democracy is a series of conflict?
I would say it is. And I think that our panel, I will call it a panel because it's only men on the panel. I think that everyone spoke about conflict resolution today, but nobody spoke about encouraging conflict. And I think that the privileged are always at peace when there's no conflict. And that could be a reason that they chose to resolve it rather than encourage it. I think every societal institution, we're having the vote today, if you ask if marriage is a conflict, everybody will be the quickest to raise the yes vote. Whether there's a predator in society because there's a prey, whether there's oxygen that balances carbon dioxide, every societal function is the basis of it all is conflict. And I think conflict in democracy is what provides its biggest check and balance. The fact that the elected leader is accountable to us is because we have the right to create conflict and discourse and debate. Which brings me to my second question. If we have no conflict, as you said, Professor Basu, then what is...
No, I did not say. I said that human life, my first sentence was that human life itself is a series of conflicts.
Right,
and it's not that democracy causes conflict. Autocracy is one way to deal with conflict, and that is to smother all conflict and create an artificial basis of peace and stability. But that peace and stability does not last. As we can see with Mao, with Mobutu, with Suharto, with Marcos, the stability that they created through autocracy did not last. Democracy creates a much more stable and continuing basis for a harmonious society if democracy is properly implemented and properly used. When you have autocrats, they of course reduce the degree of conflict, they eliminate conflict, but that is an artificial stability.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohit. We're out of time, but we would have loved this discussion to continue for, a little longer. Simon, you're up next. Tell us what you think and what your question is for my friend Ashutosh.
Okay, first of all, very briefly, I think democracy is the best way we've found so far of resolving conflicts. So I come down on that side of the argument. In the House of Commons, as an example, there are two red lines that run down the centre of the debating chamber in the Palace of Westminster. And the red lines are there in front of the government benches and the opposition benches. They're exactly 2 sword lengths apart. And that is to stop the two sides fighting. And they resolve their conflicts through debate rather than violence. So my question to Ashutosh, which I very much enjoyed your speech. It was very passionate. You spoke of Indian society as a series of contradictions and that it would survive as a civilization, but not necessarily as a democracy. Why not?
I think because when I believe about Indian civilization, I believe that democracy is the inherent element of this civilization. If you look at the Hinduism, there's no one God. There's no one book. And it has been a debating a discourse, dialogue has been the fundamental of Hinduism. So if we call Hinduism as a great civilization, so I mean to say that democracy is there. There's no contradiction in it.
Okay.
What I was trying to say is that democracy, if there is one model of democracy globally which has succeeded, it is India. This model has to be studied. Because if you just take the example of casteism in this country, there is a section of the society which had suppressed almost entire population, dealt with them inhumanely. To finish that kind of depression with one stroke of constitution, and there is no murmur. I think that's the most beautiful thing which could have ever happened to a democracy across the world. The West has not faced diversity. So if there is a like France has a problem. If there's a the number of Muslims are increasing, they get paranoid. If 9/11 happens, the Americans get paranoid.
I'm going to ask you another question because we're running out of time.
Yeah.
If that's the case, and I understand exactly what you're saying, there's an argument to say that democracy survives on economic growth and the redistribution, okay? So everybody feels they're part of this process and there is a reason for voting. Do you think that's happening in India?
Sorry, I didn't get your...
Okay, so there's an argument to say that democracy works when there is economic growth and a degree of redistribution of wealth. And I wondered if you thought that was happening sufficiently in this country to make democracy work in the future.
See, not necessarily, because when India was fighting for the independence, everybody said that there's so much poverty in this country, there's so much diversity, there's so much divisions, that India will not survive. Even the great Churchill was most vehement about it. Till 1991, and you can say that till 1993, I think India was one of the poorest countries in the world. But we had a great democracy. We didn't, despite all the skepticism of the West, we survived. And we survived beautifully. Despite the emergency imposed by, my dear friend Mr. President Baju will not like it, but Mrs. Gandhi was forced to lift emergency. That's the beauty of Indian democracy.
Okay.
It's not the imposition of the emergency, because a woman like her was forced to lift democracy. That's where the democracy succeeded in this country.
Okay. So you wouldn't, I'm just running out of time, so you wouldn't agree with Kunal's point, who said that democracy here has become a drama, a soap opera, in which people only are involved in the process on election day.
See, I personally believe that democracy is the worst from the government till we find a better one. We, as a civilization, the global civilization, we started with kinship and all kinds of things, from the royalty to autocracy, dictatorship. Why for the last 300 years since the French Revolution, we are still surviving as a democracy? Have we found another form of democracy? As you never found, as it said. How many people sitting here can say they found a best spouse? Can the husband say they got the best wives? Can the wife say they got the best husband? So why we expect that we have the best democracy? Democracy has its own imperfections till we get the perfect one.
Okay, very good.
You're treading on dangerous ground, Ashutosh. Just because you're alone and single in the city, there's no need to plunge us into this jeopardy on our home front. Thank you. Shandip, over to you. Simon, thank you
very much.
We are out of time.
Well, I don't know whether there's democracy on the home front, but there's definitely conflict. And I won't tell you on which side democracy suffers on the home front, because my wife is seated very close to where I am. I think I need to reiterate to Simon a little bit about the reference to Hinduism that Ashutosh repeatedly said, that Hinduism has flourished in this country. It is a coalition of many ideas, many philosophies, many books put together. That's one of the points he made. Perhaps he discreetly didn't tell you that the conflict between two individuals caused the writing of the biggest book in Hinduism as well. It's called the Bhagavad Gita. But we have conflict and coalition in Hinduism as we have in every other aspect of religion in this country. By the way, I'll tell you a secret. You might be wondering why I, as a moderator, am siding a little bit with those who think that democracy is, yes, a series of conflicts. The reason is we have two moderators, and my co-moderator is siding with the side that says, no, democracy is not a series of conflicts. So just in case you think my comments may be a little one-sided or biased, that's the explanation for the same. We've decided that each moderator is also going to assume a stance reflecting the yes and no that we're all going to be subject to this evening.
Thank you, Shandeep. Let's not waste any more time. Tanya, you're up against Jeff next. Jeff actually was the first speaker who spoke about democracy not being a series of conflicts. So he spoke on a completely different note from the first two speakers. So Tanya, it's up to you to tell us what you think and what you think Jeff should answer.
Okay. So to say this at the very outset, this debate isn't about a value judgment on whether democracy is good or bad. And we should really look at what democracy is. It's a system of government and it's a social contract. And the very purpose it should serve is to make society more productive and efficient. You spoke about the vitality in democracy. I'd like you to point it out to me a little more clearly, because from where I see, democracy is a system where the EVMs are hacked, people are manipulated through social media, and how does this very idea of a representative government even exist? Hasn't it been totally nullified?
Well, hi, Tanya. Thanks for listening. Vitality is a strange word. I was quoting somebody who described democracy as vital. But it seems a good word to me because if you look at any democracy, and I don't mean just voting on election day, democracy is about engaging in civil society so that you can help shape the decisions which affect your life. You said it's a social contract. It's more than that. It's about creating not just a strong economic society, it's also about creating a compassionate society. It's no good making lots of money if you're unhappy. So vitality includes empathy, which is a very strong emotion for journalists, I would say. You have to be able to put yourself in another person's shoes, otherwise you won't understand their story. It's a good emotion for politicians. What's the point of arguing with someone who agrees with you? You need conflict. And vitality would indicate that conflict is a good thing, not fighting. We talked about the sword's length in the House of Commons. It's not about fighting, it's about robust discussion. And what I like to see among young people, and what I'm noticing, is that they want to have far more say about their futures than perhaps our generation did. They're not happy to sit back and just take it. They want to shape it, which I think is a good thing. And you said social media. Well, it's there to be abused or used. So what young people seem to be doing more and more is taking control rather than letting it take control of them.
My next point is based on what you started off your speech with. And you said that the people in Chhattisgarh expressed their inconvenience and how that was an example of the success of democracy. But that was in the 80s. Closer to the 2019, we have people not expressing anguish over falling bridges, fires, or hooch deaths in Assam. So that one example doesn't really validate the success of democracy. I would like your response to that in the present day.
Again, I was quoting an example from a colleague, Mark Tully, who told us that story. But I hope it's true, by the way. But yeah, apathy is the only answer to direct action, one or the other. What are you going to do? You're going to sit back and just say, I don't care what government's in power. It doesn't make any difference. Some people have that attitude. I don't think it's a good attitude. I think, personally, you should be fined if you don't go and vote. They do that in Australia. You can go and spoil your ballot paper if you want to, but you can't sit at home. You've got to go and vote for somebody or spoil your ballot paper. And why wait for election day? Why not do things that affect your society between elections? Ecologically, you could join Friends of the Earth. You could actually join a local crime prevention unit, or pick up the litter, anything which helps build a better society and a more equal society as well, I would say.
But the vicious combination of democracy and capitalism prevents us from doing that in present-day society. My last point is a little more philosophical. Democracy is a Western concept. So isn't it indicative of epistemic violence, our adherence to it in present day? Isn't it a form of neocolonialism?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm part of a manel here. I'm aware that the word manel was used, and it does feel odd having no women up here. So, yeah, is it a colonial concept, democracy? Is that what you're saying?
A neo-colonial concept.
Possibly, but nobody's trying to make you take up democracy, are they?
Yes, they are. Big Brother's watching in lots of ways.
Perhaps, but I would have thought that now, internationally, it's up to you what you do. I don't think anybody is telling you what to do. I don't think anybody wants to tell you what to do. I think you make your bed, you lie in it. I think everybody's got problems enough of their own without wanting to tell other people what to do. Perhaps Trump does, but I think most people in the United Kingdom have enough troubles of their own now, worrying about their own democracy. You know, I'm the son of an immigrant, I'm the husband of an immigrant. We've got lots of things we need to do with our own society in terms of diversity and acceptance. So we certainly don't want to tell anybody else what to do and how to run their country.
Thank you, Tanya. Those were difficult questions, Jeff. You did rather well. Thank you. Well, the next question is for Mr. Nigam and Mudar. You have to do the honors. Would you like to sit here and speak, or would you like to use the lectern? This is fine? Okay, thank you. Yes, Mudar, your time starts now. Mic's working.
I've just heard you say something which is pertinent over the last 10 or 11 days. You said India is not a mature democracy because the unified response has been missing. And I'm just saying it from my own personal identity, that we've seen the 84 riots and how one community was targeted. I've seen the Babri Masjid post, how one community was targeted. I'm absolutely relieved that nothing's happened in the 11 days. And I think it's a sign of a mature democracy, perhaps the most mature democracy in the world. And you're actually saying it's not a mature democracy.
You know, you just picked up a sentence. When I said it's a dynamic process, it's an evolutionary process. The inherent thing is maturity in itself in it. You know, you're going through the phases of evolution and dynamism where you see in certain incidents a lot of maturity. You know, how you finally tackled 1984 riots is something is worth. Finally, the people are paying for it. Although late, if it had been a very mature democracy, probably we would have made them pay the price instantly. But because of this little, you know, state of flux, we are actually making them pay, but it's taking its own time. That is what I meant. You know, the perfection in democracy, they should be punished immediately, but then it is not happening, but it is taking its own time. That, you know, puts a doubt in the mind of people. Are we mature or not? As a person, let me tell you, we have survived this. We have survived Khalistan, we have survived Babri Masjid, we have survived what happened in Kolkata. We are surviving, but surviving is not perfection.
To that extent, you're saying it's not mature the way you describe it.
But it's a dynamic process and evolutionary as well.
I picked up on one other sentence of yours, in fact, half a sentence. You said this alienation is Kashmir. I couldn't believe what you had said. Do you actually want to repeat? Is there alienation in Kashmir?
See, there are two ways of looking at it. When I extensively traveled in Jammu and Kashmir, and while I was talking to the people out there, and that's quite some time back, I did feel there was an alienation, but there was a large population at that point of time that said, if we do not control India and blackmail Indian government, they'll trample our identity and culture. So that is the fear. Although the amount of money and the effort the government of India puts in Kashmir is phenomenal. 80,000 crore package goes there. But where does it go? That was an issue, and that is where I think the BJP wanted to join the government with the PDP, despite the fact they had ideological differences, to know the system. Where are the leakages taking place? Who are the people involved? And they paid a price nationally so far as their reputation is concerned, but they came to know the system inside. So today there is, and therefore the Prime Minister yesterday said, it is not against Kashmir, it is for Kashmir, our struggle.
Did he say it too late?
No, certainly not.
On one issue, you're saying that, there's a very delayed response in India, and that's the immature side of a mature economy. Yeah,
No,
I'm asking you, is
no,
it the delay? 11 din lag gaye?
No. I did not say delay in response of Government of India towards any step that you are taking towards Pakistan. I said delay in terms of dissent within our society. I talked about delay in the unified response that we should have had. That was the delay. Where you giving, we have left it to the government to take the best opportunity. Somebody saying war is not good. Nobody's talking about the war as of now. We don't know what Government of India is trying to do. They're absolutely silent on it. If you recall Mrs. Indira Gandhi in 1971, she did not utter a word. She was giving a speech and a chit about war was given to her, about the Western Front. She continued with her speech, did not utter anything. Then the decisive steps were taken. That is how you deal. You don't play your cards. You don't open your cards in public so far as such sensitive issues are concerned.
I'm going on to the third point. You mentioned 3 other words. There should be a limit on tolerance. Don't you think the country needs a limit on intolerance?
No. I never said. I never used the word limit on tolerance.
I think it was mentioned somewhere.
No. Somebody else may have. I never used the word tolerance. You want me to answer that?
Why not?
No. See, if you look at a concept of nationhood, which is very different from the Western concept. Western concept is one race, one language, one religion, those kind of things. But the concept that I and we in RSS believe is the diversity in unity. The underlying factor is the unity, and the surface you find different things. But they are all connected to that unified force. And idol worship is across length and breadth of the country. That's the unity. The idols may be different. You may be worshipping some other idol. You may be worshipping a different form of Krishna. You may be worshipping different form of Shiva. But the underlying unity is the same. Hindutva, somebody calls it Hinduism. I don't call it Hinduism. It is Hindutva, where everybody is happy. Everybody has a say in a same phenomena. Supreme Court has very clearly laid down in 1966 itself. Hinduism or Hindutva is just a way of life from spectrum A to spectrum B. B, you will find Islam and Christianity. A, you will find simple nature worship. So there's a huge, array of in-between things. That is what Hindutva is all about.
So I would have asked the last question. I don't have time, so I won't run through it. That conflict has to be in manageable limits. And I thought, that the greater the conflict, the greater the introspection, the greater the realization of truth. So I think the greater the conflict, I think the greater the country. And so I would have, when this manageable...
I'll just give you one example.
So yeah, manageable limits of
I'll just give you one example only. Your answer is Pakistan.
My answer is Pakistan.
No.
My answer to your question is Pakistan.
So he says uniformity does not lead to end of cessation of conflict, and that example is
Pakistan has too many conflicts, and look what it is today.
So he says uniformity in Pakistan.
So I get your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mudar.
Not that I agree with it, but I get your perspective.
Thank you. Mr. Mitter, Ranjan Mitter, to take on Jerry Rao. Mr. Rao, are you ready?
Of course he is. Mr. Rao, if I heard you if I heard you right, at one stage you said it's not democracy that leads to conflicts, it's absence of democracy that leads to conflicts. Am I right?
Correct.
What about created conflicts? All across we see that parties, to get back to power, they create conflicts.
Yes, and that is, as I said, it doesn't mean that there won't be minor riots, demonstrations.
They're not
stuff.
minor.
But there won't be major civil. No, there is a difference. There is a big difference between the 1971 Pakistani civil war and the 30, 40-year handling of the Naga and Mizo movements by India. There is a difference. There will be there. And eventually in a democracy, even after 1864, blacks didn't get vote in America for another 100 years. Only after the Civil Rights Act was passed. So it takes time, but it's not as precipitate and as violent as the breakdown of democracy.
Okay, I get your point of view. The other thing about democracy is the fact that you believe in something. You believe in a particular ideology. That's why you are in it, and there's somebody else who opposes you because he or she believes in a different form of ideology. And therefore, there's discussion, there's debate, there is conflict. But on the ground, very often we see something very different. we see convenience prevailing over conviction. And when the color changes at the ruling level, the same people make a quiet exit from route A to route B. What do you have to say about that?
You know, actually, I find that a very nice thing. In fact, even the idea of vote buying and making deals across parties which are completely opposed to each other before the polls and then come together, I find that as part of a negotiation process. It's like a market. It's like an auction where, and this is civilized.
But aren't
this
we
is
negotiating
very
ideals and ideology in the process? Aren't we selling ourselves and our souls?
Well, you know, if you choose to use words like selling ourselves and give it a high moralistic tint, then it becomes difficult. But if you say, hey, this is a deal. This is something, commerce is about deal. Trading is about deals. And these are civilized activities. As against violence, against the king, the tyrant beating up on you, markets are very civilized. And markets are about discussion, negotiation, deals.
True,
so yes, some of it does kind of get irritating and the hypocrisy gets very, very difficult to live with. But, there's this movie Spartacus, old movie, where Charles Lawton makes an interesting statement. He says, any day give me a little bit of plebeian corruption to this patrician dictatorship. He says that because the patricians, they're not corrupt, they're, have this sanctimonious position, but they can become very dangerous dictators.
Yeah, anyway, I was not talking about corruption. I was talking about moving from one ideology to a completely different one just because the ruling dispensation is different. Anyway, the third question I would have is, you spoke of a number of classic examples. What about support from democracy and elected regimes to completely autocratic dispensations, and we see many of that? Latin America, Arabia, China. We've created new problems, and that is then democratic regimes, democratically elected regimes, over the years, continuously supporting autocratic regimes. Isn't that a hypocrisy?
Well, the theoretical literature on this is very conflicted. There is one view, the Huntington kind of view, of cultural theorists, saying that it is not up to us to make Latin America or Saudi Arabia a democracy. They are probably culturally incapable of democracy. Let them sort out. In the meantime, we just live with them. It's a very cold-blooded view. There is another view which, frankly enough, strangely enough, George W. Bush believed in. He believed that he could make democracy in the Middle East. And that was part of his whole justification, the sanctimonious justification of the entry into Iraq. I don't know. I don't know. The answer to that is very complicated. I believe we in India emerged as a democracy for two reasons. One point that Ashutosh made, which Amartya Sen has repeatedly made, the argumentative tradition in our culture is very old. The tradition of debate. Nagarjuna debates somebody. Adi Shankara debates somebody. The second reason, and again, it's very difficult for us to say this because it's politically incorrect. I think it's the Anglo-Saxon connection. I think if we'd been colonized by the Portuguese or the Spanish, we wouldn't have been a democracy. It's the Anglo-Saxon connection which Raja Ram Mohan Roy understood. Right in 1830, he said we need a long period of British rule in order for us to emerge as a democracy at the end. These two things have helped us to become what we are.
So we are done in terms of time, but I think you've raised a very big question now, which is what you said now. Is democracy therefore a complete import, which we have digested, or is it something that we could not digest at all?
I think it's a bit of both. It's a bit of both.
Thank you, Mr. Mitter. Thank you, Jerry. Rajuda, it's your turn now. Mr. Raju Raman will take on Kunal Sarkar and his viewpoint on democracy and conflict.
At the very outset, I must say I don't like this term take on that Pradeep is using, because you're already creating a conflict situation here.
Let's just say take off.
Yeah. And of course, especially in this situation where Kunal Sarkar or KS and myself, asking him questions, he being the chairman of the Calcutta debating circle and also being part of it, I have to tread very carefully that I don't get expelled from that group, you see. So
We won't hold anything against you.
all right. So that you are all witnesses to that.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Kunal, I sort of listened with deep interest to your passionate views. And you did mention the incidents of the Kolkata police versus the CBI. Yeah? Don't you think both parties did their duty from their own perspectives?
Well, yes and no. I think the matter of deep regret was that the federal structure of the country, which is extremely well outlined in the Constitution, should have come to such a juvenile, we were almost like behaving like juvenile delinquents on both fronts. On both fronts. And what would have happened later on, what kind of constitutional crisis it would have precipitated later on, is in the realms of imagination. The question is, with a little bit of restraint and maturity on either side, one chap behaved as if they was releasing a missile, and then we had a completely, sort of a public dramatic exposition of our protests. Somewhere, I think this has been a very dangerous precedence set in the current context, and I hope the least it recurs, the better.
Okay, the panelist whom Kunal Sarkar replaced was actually MM, yeah?
Yes.
And you have also talked about a heroine here and a hero there, both of whom also abbreviate to an M, you see? So,
Yes.
in this context, I want to ask you again, these instances of conflict, which you're saying, and you said very vehemently that yes, it has reduced itself to a series of conflicts. There have been examples taken of Great Britain, of the United States, and so on, and there are some people who are referred to India. Now, in the Indian context, since independence, there have been such a surge of regional parties who have grown in significance. Do you think that this is contributing more to the conflict factor?
Well, it will be, because there are certain, because when India espoused democracy, remember one thing, we did not have a second political party in the horizon. So we were a very monolithic in terms of political ideology, trying to be magnanimous, because from the time probably the only opposition that Mr. Gandhi ever faced was Mr. Ambedkar. And that was in a different kind of conversation altogether. So in the current context, with regional parties coming up, etc., there needs to be show of maturity on either side. Because taking such volatile positions does not augur well and gives a lot of people wrong ideas. And if there are more serial episodes to this serial, God save us.
Okay, coming to serials, yes, you did mention soap operas and serials. Do you think that these kind of soap operas and things, which are partly promoted by the media in some way, and the media again being controlled by certain corporates, and the corporates being controlled by political parties, do you think there is a kind of fixed agenda to it, that these soap operas are supposed to divert you from certain real conflicts and maybe lead you to some things that everything is hunky-dory?
If there is one point of desperation, or despondency, that one point of despondency is that we have, over the course of last 70 years, failed to make the Indian democracy accountable. When India came into the global limelight was when lakhs and lakhs of Indian soldiers were going out to the First World War. And remember, during First World War, communications was in the terms of homing pigeons. You and I don't use homing pigeons for communications anymore. So the world has moved on. Accountability has to be established. A government over 5 years cannot, in the last 2 months of its life, suddenly give you a balance sheet of its achievements and failures. The goalposts have to be set first. And somebody has got to answer, why did we not achieve such and such parameters in terms of employment, in terms of health, in terms of education? Because this is just coming as a profound social afterthought after all the political gymnastics have been enacted. That is the point of despondency on the current sort of drama of Indian democracy.
Okay, the time is up. I'll
Yes.
just end by saying, you talked about healthcare and so on and so forth. If there had been answers to healthcare from the part of the government, do you think all these institutions like Medica, super speciality and all would have flourished?
Why not? Why not?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
On that note, I think just so that we have a healthy audience and they have a right to ask questions to our panelists, we have 5 minutes where members of the audience can come up and ask questions. There are 3 microphones, one on the left,
Hello.
one on the right, and if you don't want to lean to the right or left, you can be in the center. There's one in the middle. You can walk up to the microphone and ask a question, as long as the question is shorter than the speech that provoked it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So very interactive, very nice session. This question is to Dr. Kunal Sarkar. I'm Dr. Imran Wali. The question is, in this democracy, a series of conflict, where seriously does the role of health, which I consider very important, being a doctor, play? Because as someone said, 80,000 crore package was given to Kashmir. What about the health so that we can improve it? Because a healthy nation is a healthy, very healthy nation. That's it. Thank you.
Imran, thank you for a question. You know, I once made a rough estimation that if you added up the 2G, 3G coal scam and some of the minor weekend scams that happened in this part of the country, then that would have paid for the healthcare of India for about 25 years.
Right, right.
Not a single Indian would have had to spend a single rupee on healthcare if that found its diversion to the right channel. Be so it may.
Right.
The important point is, after waiting for 68 years, we were the only democracy on the face of the planet where healthcare was not one of the 2 main election agendas. At last, healthcare has come into the social consciousness. It has been floated as a scheme, but again, we regret that this is again being dragged into the mud for n number of states are fighting a mud wrestle over here over the center-state one-upmanship. The sooner it resolves, the better, because we are behind a lot of countries as far as equitable health care is
So do you
concerned.
see any light at the end of the
We
tunnel?
do, yes. I am an eternal optimist. And the main light is healthcare is now on the visible electoral agenda. So I'm sure something will happen.
Thank you, thank you. Is there a second question also from that quadrant? Yes? Professor Basu, you wanted to say something? Okay, just give Professor Basu a minute.
If I might just respond to Dr. Sarkar on one point, which is that the issue of whether or not a government has achieved the preset goals, I would recommend there is a 48-month scorecard that this particular government has put out. It is absolutely remarkable. In fact, perhaps we can have a camera focused on this. I just pulled it up. It has point by point, detailed discussion of exactly what the government has achieved on about 14 different parameters. So I think in terms of transparency, we have that now. And the second point I'd like to make is that we, in terms of healthcare, we now have, for the first time, a government attempting to achieve universal healthcare. There is a universal health insurance scheme that the central government has come up with that is benefiting 500 million households, except Bengali rural households, because the government of this state has chosen not to participate. But already, the beneficiaries of this are about, the known beneficiaries as of the budget time on February the 1st, was about 12 million. So 12 million people are already benefiting from free universal health insurance. You're beginning to see that happen.
Just a small intervention so that we get on with the questions. A small intervention is the syndrome not just in Bengal but across many other states. Delhi is one such state. The tragedy in India is Aam Aadmi has also become a party, right? So apart from that kind of euphemisms, the other problem is that where the Aam Aadmi is losing out is in this jostle and hustle between the center and the states, you are not getting the true value, the true equity in the funds which are being provided.
Thank you.
So it is
Ashutosh,
being
you had a
underutilized.
I just want to say one thing, that I think it's a good thing to talk about education and health and all that. But the fact is, achievement of the government can only be found, you just walk to any hospital and realize how much has been done. The tragedy is, and I fully agree with Kunal Saab, that the only government, though I have left that party, which has put an agenda in the governance is Aam Aadmi Party, education and health, and you have to visit and see and realize how much it has done. Unfortunately, we are living in a time when the perception, we are creating a perception without any reality. It has become a game of how big and how much you can sell a product. Whether the product has got a content, nobody knows.
Right. Last question from this gentleman. You want to, let's see how the time runs. Make it very short, please.
Yes. Good evening. My question is, whatever we are talking about democracy is that it gives rise to question everything and everyone. But what we are missing is that it does not give us rise to question our nation itself. I'm not talking about government. We can question government.
Okay.
But should we not be allowed to question the nation? So sedition law is not the wrong thing to be in a democratic country.
Okay. Thank you. Who do you want to answer your question?
It's open question for everyone.
Please take a seat.
The moment you start questioning your nation, the problem of existence comes into question. Its unity is threatened. And once you threaten the unity, the conflict becomes out of hand. And that is where I said conflicts have to be managed. And there has to be a conflict resolution mechanisms. You do not question your nationhood. And therefore, question of sedition and things like that, there is a lot of debate going on whether it should be there or not. But I still feel, that given the challenges this country has, you have to take it case by case basis.
I'd like to add. One minute. I'd like to add to Mr. Nikam. The evidence, particularly in the last 20 years, is very tragic and alarming. When Yugoslavia split up, what we saw was something that was horrendous, Srebrenica and so on. If India splits up, let me tell you, Bosnia will look like a tea party. Every single state has linguistic, religious minorities from other states. The borders are not clear, they're completely porous. There's lots of Gujaratis in Maharashtra, lots of Odias and Biharis in Gujarat. If this kind of thing happens, the consequences are so, in the old days, in the classical Sanskrit texts, there's an expression called Matsya Nyaya, when the big fish eat the small fish. That will be the frightening prospect. So please be very careful. Of course, technically, there is freedom of speech. You can question the nation. But the consequences you need to think about, and it's not an easy one.
Yes. Ashutosh?
See, I belong to a religion which allows me to question my gods. I think that kind of freedom I got from my religion itself. It's not about nation. The issue is what kind of nation we want. That's the issue. Unfortunately, I'm mixing two things. Today, the nation which claim as a concept, as a theory, does it have the participation of minorities? Does it have the participation of Dalits? Does it have the participation of backwards? Or it's just only a concept of upper caste? This question has to be asked. Yes. Otherwise, it will be difficult to survive as a nation. And I, being a student of Soviet Union, I can tell you, the politics of Russification has created a monster which finally led to the disintegration of Soviet Union. For God's sake, let people question the concept and the nature of nation. Let people omit out where, allow those people who have been left out in this concept of nation. The one kind of nation, the ideology of nation, will lead to the disintegration of this nation. That's my...
Yeah. Thank you.
And the last question.
Last question, please.
The question is that whatever you told now that Matshonnonai, that is now held in Kashmir by Pakistanis or others maybe. But I think, do you think that it will be better if there is medical healthcare project take by the Indian central government or state government for the Kashmiris, then it will be help them, democracy.
You are asking whether that would bring peace to a troubled land.
Right.
Yes. Anybody on this side would like to venture an
Sir,
opinion?
I'll just make a medical intervention over here, which is by and large, given the rest of the country, and it shows, I'm just no propaganda for the current dispensation. Over the years, a lot of resources has gone into Kashmir, and their overall medical health care is not bad at all, right? So coming from a stupid doctor, I think you've got to look back at the fact that the sense of separation of Kashmiris go far before independence. The sense of separation of Kashmir goes back to the Anglo-Sikh wars. It goes back to the time when a predominantly Muslim population was up against a Hindu king, and there was a whole kind of sort of muddle up of history. It was an entirely different question as the conversation between Nehru and Patel and so on and so forth, that whether in contrast to Hyderabad you should have ever stepped into there is a different matter. Now you cannot revisit that anymore.
Yep.
But the question is, through perhaps as human beings, not as great political pundits, we believe that channels of communication will have to be opened. But by and large, we visited Kashmir. We visited some of the medical facilities there. And honestly speaking, they are much better than the rest of the country. So, but still, that doesn't mean that you don't go on the other development programs, whether it is encouraging the youth, employment, jobs, distraction from this kind of path. I think all those are very serious questions that needs to be looked into.
Just to add, from where Dr. Kunal finished, J&K is the problem. Obviously, there is a history to it. But when you imposed Farooq Abdullah in a farcical election, when rigged, the problem arises there. The true spirit of democracy gets defeated. That is exactly what happened. And look at the people today, the present leadership out there, Mufti, Omar Abdullah, or Nabi. They're not addressing the problem. This present leadership has failed. It has become inconsequential. Therefore, it's your job to find out our alternative leadership out there. The pro-India alternative leadership which has come through Panchayati elections recently held. These were boycotted by the mainstream regional parties, but still huge participation took place and the new leadership has come up. You have to promote that leadership and you will find one day the problem sooner than later will be solved.
I think on Kashmir, it's just worth remembering a few other things. Mirwais Umar Farooq, the leader of the Hurriyat, his father was killed by Pakistan. And yet, he is still pro-Pakistan. It is not that he is pro-Pakistan or pro-secession from India because he has strong convictions. I think he is held at gunpoint by Pakistan and has to have that view. Similarly, if you look at Abdul Ghani Lone, he was also killed by Pakistan in 1999. His son, Bilal Lone, is also part of Hurriyat. So you have a terrorism problem as well. I think it's important to understand in Kashmir, we don't have simply an issue of alienation. We have a very serious issue of terrorism. Kashmir's accession to India was completely legal. Unfortunately, Mountbatten, who was appointed by Nehru as chief of the Defense Committee of the Cabinet of India, wrote a letter to the Maharaja of Kashmir immediately after accession, which is the basis of Pakistan's claim on Kashmir. But when you look at our maps, the maps that are drawn in India, Gilgit is always included. Gilgit and Baltistan is basically more than 1/3 of Kashmir. That 1/3 of Kashmir was taken away in a coup 2 days after the accession of Kashmir and has been part of Pakistan ever since. And our maps still foolishly show that entire area, the largest part of Kashmir, the most strategic area, as part of India. And it is illegal to show a map that doesn't have Gilgit in India. But Gilgit ceased to be in India 2 days after the legal accession of Kashmir. So the issue of Kashmir is extremely complex, and I think boiling it down to healthcare, the quality of social services, probably trivializes the complexity of the issue.
Irrepressible Ashutosh wants to have a last word, but make it a very brief sentence.
Very brief. I think the problem with the Kashmir is that we are trying to find a military solution to the political problem. That's a fundamental thing. And second thing is, if you could stop, I'm just making a very anti-democratic statement, if you could switch off few television channels who are indulging into jingoistic debate and discussions, probably half of the problem is sorted out. And I'm saying on record, because the interlocutor appointed by the Modi government has come back and said the 5 TV channels, they are creating more problems than the Kashmiris in Valley.
I think it's probably too tempting as we come to the end of a debate on democracy that the 2 outstanding items that seem to have survived the entire debate are Kashmir and healthcare. I think the problem about Kashmir is not its history but its geography. And the problem of Kashmir is not its past but its future. The problem of healthcare in this state is that it is one of the paradoxes of our democracy that most of the recipients of the free healthcare in this state are torn between understanding whether that's funded by the center or funded by the state. And the state spends a lot of its resources proving that it's not funded by the center, and the center is spending a lot of its resources proving it's not funded by the state. And it is a paradox of our democracy, of course, that we illuminate the face of the giver whenever there is a program for social or economic upliftment, and we darken and anonymize the face of the recipient. And that's what's happening with healthcare, at least in a lot of this country and certainly in this state. The time has come for you to cast your vote. And as I said, we have 2 moderators, and therefore the 2 moderators will sum up their arguments very quickly. And Pradeep, the noes have to say first, so Pradeep will tell us why he thinks. Is democracy a series of conflicts? Pradeep sings emphatically, together with 4 of our 6, three of us 6 panelists. Definitely no, democracy is not about a series of conflicts. And he'll sum up their opinion before I have the last word, and then you can vote.
Yes. Thank you, Shandip. I am privileged to have 3 speakers on this dais who believe that democracy is not a series of conflicts. We firmly believe that democracy is the best system you can possibly have to resolve diversity. It's the best system you can possibly have to hear the voice of the people. It's the best system that we can possibly have in human civilization to understand what is it that our youth are looking forward to, what is the care that our elderly expect. We think it's the best system possible, and I was honored that Professor Basu came on board first, and while his speech covered many, many names, the point he made was simple. Conflict has been precipitated by those within democracies, by individuals who are autocrats, by Winston Churchill, by Indira Gandhi, who were autocrats in their own right, in their own conviction, and therefore, while they thrived in the midst of a democratic structure, they precipitated conflict. Ashutosh came on next, and he made a very forceful case about how resolution of conflict through mechanisms that are constitutional or otherwise is the best possible hope we have to make democracy work, and above all else, we have to make democracy work. Well, Jerry had me a little confused at first. I thought he was a nota, because he was going neither here or there, and he said the motion didn't agree with him at all, rather like a cold cup of coffee or bad sambar. But then he came along to our side, in which he really upheld very forcefully, with examples that started from Plato to the English Civil War, the American Civil War, Mujibur Rahman and the creation of Bangladesh, and very recently the creation of Telangana. His point was that conflict may be prolonged, conflicts may be bloody, But ultimately, if the American senators had continued to debate in the houses of Congress, if the people of India had listened to the people of Telangana a little more carefully some years ago, if they had been democratic, we would not have had conflict. So we, the naysayers, believe that democracy is not a series of conflicts. We think it's the best possible system. There are incidental issues, there are occasions, there are instances, there are events where there is an event of conflict. But that's not the way democracy works. Over to you, Shandip, who, despite his very benign appearance, tends to uphold conflict.
Actually, three people on this dais have said that democracy is a series of conflicts, and on their behalf, I will agree completely with Pradeep. They all have said democracy is the best system of government. It is the best way to govern. It is the best thing we have until we find something better. And so there is no disagreement about democracy being the best system of governments, at least on this planet, if not in the solar system currently. The problem that three individuals on this side have had is that democracy causes conflicts. And one has illustrated it by telling you about Brexit, building a Hadrian's Wall yet again to try and isolate a country from a region. That conflict of a region versus the country, everybody in this state understands that very well. That wall which we heard about when we had a reference from another speaker to the Berlin Wall, another wall which caused conflict but may stand as a symbol of democracy, just proving that conflicts are necessary in a democracy. And more currently, a more contemporary wall, which one of the world's largest democracies is debating about, which is causing a conflict between the president and the rest of the country. So walls have been sources of conflicts as walls have been erected in democracies for many years. We heard about Facebook, how Facebook was supposed to be the epitome of democracy, where you could write what you wanted to about the rest of the world and even about yourself. And how today it's a source of conflict with governments stamping down on Facebook, curbing the rights of Facebook. From Facebook to face-off. We've heard about the face-off between two security forces on a street not far away from here. Two disciplined forces of a democratic country just because they owe allegiance to two different political masters. Showing once again how democracy has inherent within it conflicts. You know, in this country, if a state says something against the center and wants to break away, we call it a symbol of our democracy. But within a state, if a district wants to break away from the state, we call it a symbol of conflict. So there is a paradox in the term democracy and conflict, but certainly the two live with each other. You know, we need democracy for a concept. We also need democracy for a conception. And every politician will tell you concepts cause conflicts, and every parent will tell you conceptions do the same. What we have therefore felt from this half is that democracy has at its soul conflict. Look at this country. You get elected. To stay elected, the first thing you must cause is a conflict. It may be a conflict within yourself. You may have voted against GST 5 years ago when you were in opposition. Now you want to vote for it because you're in the government. So there's a conflict even within the symbols of democracy as to which way they will vote on various issues, depending on which side of the treasury benches they're sitting on. We don't have them separated by two lengths of swords for our foreign visitors. It wouldn't make a difference. They get into the well of the house and beat each other up. So we feel, and our speakers from this side of the floor have rightly felt, that democracy causes conflict. It causes conflicts in the minds of those who represent democracy. it causes conflicts between the centers and the state, because to stay in power, you have to say the state is at fault and cause a conflict. To stay in power at the state, you have to say the center is at fault and cause a conflict. And this conflict is necessary in a democracy. We're not saying it's bad, but we're saying it is an inherent part of democracy. And that's I think, the summing up statement from those who have felt that democracy and conflicts go hand in hand. And finally, of course, you don't have to trust anybody. We will trust you, because the spirit of democracy is in your hands as you have that electronic machine or that piece of paper. And we're going to ask you, those of you that felt, is democracy a series of conflicts? Those who think undoubtedly the answer is yes, please show us this red side of that paper. Okay? Those of you who have an electronic machine, those of you think that yes is the answer, please press A on your machine. Those of you think no is the answer, please press no on the machine. At the same time, those of you who have this in your hands and think no is the answer, hold up that yellow card in your right hand, please. Right, the breathtaking finish as we see what is the electronic result of this conflict of democracy, or the democratization of this conflict. Aha! Well, the vote has certainly swung in favor of those who think no, but I hate to tell you, Pradeep.
Yeah, we're a bit like the Indian team at the World Cup final. We did very well, but didn't quite get there. But we've actually gained on the opposition. So the number of people who believe that democracy is not a series of conflicts, our flock is growing. So the other side, be forewarned.
And if we had this debate going on for another 7 days, maybe they would have caught up in the swing. But at this moment, the members of the Calcutta Club believe that democracy is a series of conflicts, and therefore believes that democracy, as I say, always dictates your desire, but destroys your decision. On that note, good evening.